Sometimes it's difficult getting started in your daily schedule. Is it possible we don't have order? In our study today, we want to look at some of the structures or the division of the book of Genesis. We'll see a couple of them today, and then we'll conclude next week, which will make it easier when it comes to understanding and reading the Word. So I want to make it easier for you to understand what God is saying so that we can all wind up on the same page. With that being said, welcome to Hosea International Speaks. We want to start our study today with the first 5 books of the Bible, which we spoke about last week, called in the Hebrew language the Torah. To most of it is called the Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5. For example, the Pentagon has 5 sides to its structure. Therefore, the Pentateuch has 5 books to its structure. Now, the Torah, as mentioned, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then the rest of the Old Testament is divided into the Nebaim, which is the Hebrew word for prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the Hebrew word for the writings. This is how the Hebrew Bible is divided. The Old Testament in the Hebrew is called the Tanakh, which is the abbreviated word for Torah, Nebaim, and Ketuvim. Now, just to let you know, Jesus gave validity to the Tanakh when he mentioned the deaths of Abel and Zacharias. In the New Testament, it's Zacharias. In the Old Testament, it's Zechariah. And you can see that in the scripture, in the word, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 35. And let me read that to you. It says, this is Jesus speaking. It's in red. That you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. And you can also find that same scripture in the book of Luke, chapter 11, verse 51. Abel was murdered in the book of Genesis, and Zechariah was murdered in the book of 2 Chronicles. But you say, wait a minute. 2 Chronicles is in the middle of the Old Testament. And yes, that's true. But in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew writings, 2 Chronicles is the last book of the writings. The Nebaim. The Ketuvim. In the middle of it is the Nebaim, the prophets. Okay? And that's the way the Hebrew have divided their book. Now, let's look at the Hebrew word Torah. Mind you, this will not be an exhaustive study, but I encourage you to go and do some more study yourself. Look it up on the internet. There's plenty of information on the internet to begin to look at this word. But let's get a closer look. And in the reading, and I quote from the reading of the Pentateuch and historical introduction. The meaning of the word Torah is teaching, instructions, learnings. It means direction. It means precept. It means statute. And it also means doctrine. It comes from the prime root to flow as water. So that's, in other words, you want the word to get into, and it begins to flow, move as streams that's coming down, and also giving you a refreshing when you see that, to flow as water. It also has a connotation as to point, as if by aiming the finger, to point a direction. Remember, if you haven't read the word, you remember in the life of Abraham, God pointed Abraham to an area and he had to go research it. He had to go throughout the land and God was pointing him in that direction. It also means to inform. I don't want to get too much into Abraham. We'll look at his life when we get into the book of Genesis. It also means the word Genesis to lay a foundation, to sprinkle again, as water. The Greek counterpart now is the word deknuo, which means to show, and in the same sense as to point to something in order to draw attention to. I hope you're writing this down. To point to something in order to draw attention to. In other words, as you read the scripture, let it point to something in your life in order to draw attention to so that you can follow in the footsteps. The second Greek meaning, it means to cause to see and to bring to pass. A third meaning is to cause to experience. All that was said so that you, the individual, may begin to form a solid foundation in your life as you read the scriptures daily. And I emphasize this. Let me re-emphasize also. Read the scripture daily. You don't know what's going to you don't know how it's going to divide you, guide you. But it might begin to divide certain things in your life, things you might have to drop off, things you might have to begin to pick up and put in your life. And let the word speak and operate in your life personally. Now, I'm going to recommend you how you should read the word so that you can begin to speak to God and then let God speak to you. And I believe I brought this out last week. Read 5 Psalms a day, and it's that might give you words to speak to God. And then after you read 5 Psalms a day, read 1 proverb. There's 31 proverbs, and most of the times there is 30 days in the month. So read a proverb a day and read 5 Psalms a day. 5 Psalms, you speaking to God. And, let me just say this. Most of us like to outspeak God, but God can say so much in just a few words. So you speak to God by the 5 Psalms, and then let God to speak to you by the 1 proverb. And I can guarantee he will begin to speak to you by then. With that said, let's go ahead and continue with the author of the word of the Torah. What a Torah scholar must do is emphasize the essential points. Now, this is, I'm going to quote Rabbi Yuval Shalom, and he says this: that which makes the Torah is not dependent upon the question of who wrote it. What makes the Torah is the assertion that the master of the universe uttered it word for word, in a vision and not with riddles. You can read that in Numbers chapter 12, verse 8. Now, the Talmud, I'm throwing another term at you. The Talmud, which is the Jewish interpretation of the Torah, holds that the Torah was written by Moses, with the exception of the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy describing his death and burial being probably written by Joshua. This is quoted by Rashi. And who's Rashi? He's another Jewish rabbi. And his name stands for Rabbi Shlomo Isaac. That's the shortened version. You're going to see names like Rashi and Maimonides and other things. And so you go, we'll look at those down the line because you might want to look these guys up. And he's the one that spoke. He said from the Talmud, God spoke them and Moses wrote them with tears. So now Rashi, or Rabbi Solomon Isaac Shlomo Isaac, lived between the time of 1040 and 1105, living about 65 years. Now, Exodus also states in chapter 24, verse 4, Moses wrote all the words of Yahweh. And also in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, verse 24, says, and I quote, Moses finished the writings of the words of this law in a book until they were complete. Now, this irrefutably says Moses was the author of the Torah. Now, continue in verse 24. When Moses had completed the writings, the words of this law in a book from beginning to end, he gave the command to the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, saying, take this book of the law and put it beside the ark of the covenant of Yahweh your father, so it may be there as a witness to you. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and begin Genesis and get right into it. Just to reiterate now, the first of these writings, which we call Genesis, Moses probably wrote in the wilderness after he had been on the mountain with God. And as he framed the tabernacle, so he did with the framing or the writing of Genesis. Now, Genesis, the word Genesis is actually borrowed from the Greek Septuagint. And you can begin to see when you begin in your research and in your studies, if you see the Roman letters or the Roman numeral LXX, it stands for 70 in the Greek. And Genesis signifies the original or generations or Genesis, or more fittingly, it is the history of origins or the creation of the world. It also talks about the entrance of sin and death into it, the invention of the arts, the rise of nations, and especially the planting of the early church. And you'll see that when he talks about the congregation. Now, the word congregation actually means a congregation. It doesn't have any pointing to the word church. But some of the scholars like to use the Old Testament congregation as the church. But when we look at the division, it's going to be more like Jesus used the word in Matthew chapter 16 when he said, upon this, basically Peter's confession of faith that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, upon this confession, I will build and he doesn't use the word church, he uses the Greek word ecclesia, which is a governmental term. And so when he was dealing with his congregation in the wilderness, he was setting up a government, God's government. And we want to see that when we look at the book of Genesis and the state of it in its early days. It is also the history of generations, the generations of Adam. We'll also see Isaac in there. We'll also see, Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and all of those that have to go. We begin to see the beginning of those. And if you want to look at some more even excerpts, so you can read John Wesley's notes on the Bible. You can find that online too. So if you want to go ahead and look at those areas, you can begin to see some of those. Now, the Hebrew name given to the first book is the Hebrew word Bereshit, or beginnings. And each book, just to say this, is named after either the first word of the book or the first line of that book. For example, like we just said, Genesis means Bereshit, or the beginning. Exodus, if you want to know what Bereshit is, Beresheet, Bereshit. It also, the word Exodus in the Hebrew is the word Shemot. These are the names. The word Shemot is Shem, plural, Shemot. These are the names. Shemot is that spelling. Now, Leviticus is called Vayikra. And this is, and he is calling. And we can see what we begin to see. We begin to see it, the setup of the priesthood, and he's calling the tribe of Levi by name. That word Vayikra is spelled Vayyiqra, Vayikra. And then Numbers, the Hebrew word is Bamidbar, Bemidbar, and that's in the wilderness. And then the Deuteronomy is called Devarim. These are the words. Devarim is the plural for the Hebrew word dabar. So we can begin to see this. And then each book is then divided into sections, and we will explore each section beginning with Genesis. And with that said, I will see you next week. But now, if you have any questions on today's lessons, go ahead and email me at hoseainternational@yahoo.com. That's hoseainternational@yahoo.com. Or you can also write me at hoseaintspeaks@gmail.com. That's hoseaintspeaks@gmail.com. And with that, this is Dr. Ray saying I'll see you next week.